Why the idea of theorizing up, I think, appeals to me is one, I think it reflects kind of a grounded, reality-based approach to developing theories about the world. There's something that feels small d democratic about theorizing up, in that you're kind of grounding yourself in what you're looking at and trying to build up from there. And I'm going to give you a little bit of kind of biography here. I was always interested in kind of understanding how people's local understandings and differing perspectives were maybe connected to their social location. I went to grad school in sociology. This is important. I considered education, actually, because I was coming off of 10 years of doing mostly kind of NGO work, very community-based work. So when I got to grad school, I kind of dove towards things that I think fit with this kind of ground-up approach, which for me was ethnographic methods, this idea of symbolic interactionism, which is really looking at people's everyday interactions and how they're making sense of things. And also what I came to understand as grounded theory, which is the method of analysis where you're really looking at the data and trying to formulate hypotheses and potential theoretical ideas from that. I liked the idea that I think both of these things hold of trying to ground one's analysis in what the people one talked with and spent time with treated as significant and important. So not me, the sociologist, going in and saying, I think this is the important question or this is the important issue for these people, but to say, when I spend time with these people in their everyday lives, when they could talk about kind of whatever comes up, what seems to matter to them, and then how can I try to understand and explain that? Now, that doesn't mean, of course, we don't go in with our own biases, our own positions, our own things we care about. But I do think keeping that kind of openness is important to kind of prevent external theoretical frameworks from maybe kind of weighing on the situation in ways that they don't necessarily matter to the people there. One way I think I learned how to theorize up in grad school, and this is part of what my own program emphasized, was just kind of relentlessly returning to the data you had. So as soon as you start to go off on a flight of fancy about how, oh, this is really about, Marx's theory of alienation, or this is really about, someone else's theory of whatever, you'd have to bring it back to the actual evidence you have. I know that seems kind of simple in a way, but I do think sometimes things that focus on engaging with theory can kind of emphasize the theory way more than that. And the people you talk to, of course, they're not going to use those words about in theoretical conversations, but what might matter to them might be different than what you would like to matter to them or what you expect might matter to them. So my current study is a study of white Western expatriates in Abu Dhabi, a group of which I am a member, which has its own challenges and advantages. I've done 2 years of field work at a social club, mostly for British expatriates. I've done 85 interviews with different expats from the US, the UK, South Africa, Australia, basically, as someone said, the Commonwealth countries. I didn't go in with a certain question in mind. I always joke with my students that we have this idea that by the time you write the paper, it's like, my question was blank. But in fact, many of us, and definitely me, and I think it's good to talk about this openly, the question really kind of comes at the end in a way which again stresses people out of different backgrounds. But I think for me, in the end, it makes it work better, or at least work the way that I like to do it. But it is quite harrowing. What is this really about? Or as May said the other day, is this a thing? So anyway, what am I doing now? Now I'm doing a little piece of this big project, which came out of the interviews, which is really about how these people think, talk about, and interact with the domestic workers that many of them employ. The interviews were very open-ended. So this is another way that I keep things open and stressful. Maybe we should have a workshop called Open and Stressful, because it is I don't have a list of questions for them. I do have a list of questions, but it's quite open-ended, and I really let them kind of lead where it's going to go. One thing many people started talking about unsolicited was having maids and nannies, many of them for the first time in their lives, what that felt like, how they managed that, how it changed their life for the better, how it made them feel kind of weird. Once I kind of saw this as an emerging concern among this group, I kind of intentionally would bring it up, if other people didn't bring it up themselves, to collect more information on this kind of sub-theme. So then I started to analyze that data and say, okay, how do people talk about it? What do they say? Are there patterns? Are there themes? All the stuff we do. And I saw that there's some variation in how people did it. And so what this developing paper is going to be about really is the different styles that people consume service labor. While gathering the data and looking at it, I started to first look at theory and literature. So here's where Theorizing Up comes in. Now, what's funny is I'm not sure I take my own advice, because while I'll tell capstone students, don't worry about the theory till later, get all your data. You don't want to be, worrying about what other people said about it, see what you can figure out about it. But I think we all have this instinct that if you're reading something about it, you're doing some work and towards it. And especially when you don't know what you're doing yet, reading something that someone else wrote about something that's all put together and clear can make you feel like you're doing something, which you are. But will that be relevant in the end to what you write? Not sure, especially if you do the way things I do. So this is where I came up with this this phrase that my colleagues and I in grad school came up with, called the graveyard of literatures, which is like all the books or articles or things you've read that you never used in your final thing because you thought it might be relevant, or because you just wanted to read something and feel like you were getting something done. Now, the good news is a lot of that ends up, I think, helping you later in ways you didn't anticipate. So I've read a bunch of things that they don't say, forget it. Oh yeah, remember I did read that. In fact, just this morning that happened. I was like, I have some notes on this book that I never used before because I thought it might be helpful, but now it's coming back. And I think if you tend to look at kind of the same things over time, which many of us do, it is kind of getting a grasp on like all the literature out there, which can be quite terrifying. Anyway, so then the question is, what am I talking about here, right? Relationships between domestic workers and their employers. What is that? And this goes back to this question that May and I have talked a lot about, of which I was taught to think about as, what is this a case of? Or in other words, what is the phenomenon of interest in this study? Another phrase that I found useful is the idea of constructing the object, which I think was something Bourdieu said, which is like, I don't really know what this is yet, and that's fine. I don't necessarily want to use other people's labels for it. I'll give you an example. I was talking to somebody about this. I said, I'm doing this thing about, so it's going to be about labor exploitation. So that was just the assumption on this other person's part. So, is this a case of labor exploitation? Like, it could be, you could write a thing about that, but I don't know that that's what I want to do. But that's my point. It's like, that's one thing. And once you say that, as I've talked to May about, that triggers a whole bunch of literature you could read, places you could go, analysis you could get, right? And not even in a negative way, just in like, there are many, many alternatives. I think this is what's quite, again, open yet stressful about what we do, is that you could write 20 different papers about the exact same thing you're looking at. So that kind of creativity about what theory you do link up with is both exciting and can feel, I think, very overwhelming. So I'll tell you about some things that are in my graveyard on this project. One thing I noticed is when some people talked about having maids and nannies, they were kind of embarrassed about it. They felt kind of unsure about it. Just something about how they talked about it seemed like they weren't sure if it was right. They weren't sure how to do it. Just from that initial kind of run of looking at my stuff, I said, okay, maybe this is about how people justify things that they're doing that they don't feel great about. So how do people talk about things that they do that feel a little bit weird to them? There's an entire subfield in sociology about this, which is called accounts. How do people give accounts of their life that kind of try to make them look good, basically? I read a lot of stuff. I probably read like 25 to 30 things in this. I'm not using any of that now. And part of why I'm not is because as I looked more closely at my data, a lot of these people actually don't feel conflicted about this. And so this was a major turning point for me to realize I was bringing my own assumptions on, one, maybe how I thought people should feel about it, two, how some people did feel about it, and three, a kind of underlying assumption of a lot of current literature in the US about upper class people, that they do feel this kind of guilt and anxiety. But I think that's only liberal upper class people. So this in some ways could be a little intervention that my paper can make, is a lot of people have written about upper class people being anxious. In my case, there's variation within that. The second one I tried was really about inequality in everyday life. So this is a case of two people, a white expat and a domestic worker who's usually female, usually from a very poor background. How do those two kind of people interact in life, right? How do they negotiate that? What does it mean? How does it feel? What do they do? So part of what I had to do here, and this is also more work, is instead of looking for an overarching theory, look for other substantive books about a similar situation. So for example, there's a whole book on janitors and Ivy League colleges. There's a whole book about doormen that Peter Bierman wrote. Basically, this is what my advisor would call analogical thinking. What are other things kind of like this, but in a different setting? So where one person's working for someone else, but the class position is quite extreme, yet they're interacting in daily life, right? Now, of course, part of that is the literature on domestic workers, of which there is actually a lot. That led me to this, there's a whole part of sociology called economic sociology. And so there's a whole part of that, which is called relational economic sociology, which is about how people's in everyday relationships that are kind of in some ways embedded in or shaped by kind of a market or economic relationship, how do those relationships work and how does that go? Again, none of this seemed to end up being that helpful, at least not yet. So strike two on the literature subfields. Okay, but hang on, we're gonna get somewhere eventually. A third thing I thought of, and this came from looking in my data really closely, is all of these people, as they talked about their maids and nannies, seem to be falling back on recognizable discourses. So for example, there's a group of employers that I talked to, not a group like they're together, but like a pattern where they would often talk about the culture which the nanny came from, how they're poorly educated, how they don't really know how to work very well, how that seems to be related to the country they're from, and how gender relations are in that country. And so there's just like a lack of a work ethic or whatever. So this to me was like, ding, this is kind of like this, what in the US we call like a culture of poverty argument, which is that there are people who are just not really cut out to work very hard and we have to deal with them and what a struggle and et cetera. Unfortunately, there's not really a theory about that as a discourse, but I know it is a recognizable discourse and I could probably find stuff about it. Then I thought, well, maybe what this paper is about in part is how these different kinds of employers use different discourses to kind of legitimize or talk about how they do this, right? And so another discourse that keeps coming up a lot is the very benevolent Western person, buying things for their nanny, doing things for their nanny. And this is, again, a discourse that there's a ton of stuff about in terms of like aid work and missionaries and colonization. And, so there's a bunch of that. So I'm starting to see kind of cultural patterns crop up in the ways people are talking that are familiar to other cultural patterns that could maybe give this some shape in a way, right? Now, again, is this a paper primarily theoretically about cultural patterns and frameworks and all that? I don't know, but it's something that's going on there. And especially when you study things like culture and talk, you need something to give it a shape. Like, what are we doing here? Is it a discourse? Is it in sociology, there's a million, is it a schema? Is it boundary work? Is it, status? Is it whatever? So anyway, that's another thing I started reading about. Now, again, I think it's helpful to talk to you. I feel like I'm in it's like a therapy group because I have to check myself from reading a million things on each of these because then I'm like, oh, I read like 20 things on discourses, frameworks, blah, blah. These are all still kind of alive as possibilities, right? And some of them could be brought in different ways in the final paper. But whether one of them is like the overarching main argument, is not yet clear, or I should say the theoretical conversation that you're contributing to, right? Which I think is unfortunate that gets obsessed about so much, but in reality, that is part of what I am expected to do as a sociologist, especially in certain kinds of publications. Anyway, I think I told all of you this, but Rachel Pereñas was visiting Dubai a few weeks ago, and I met with her, and then she kind of had an idea that I think is the one that I like best so far, which is basically saying, what if this is less about the relationship between the domestic workers and the employers and is more about the employers themselves and how, in a way, they use how they talk about their nanny as a way to present a certain kind of identity. And I think that's actually really helpful. And it resonates with something I've been thinking about a lot, which is that now we're getting into another literature, which is kind of upper class people and how they present identities. And one thing that's talked about a lot in that literature is people presenting it through the consumption of material goods, right? This shouldn't surprise us at this point. But what she has said, and what someone else said to me a while ago, is like, in some ways, these people are presenting status by not just having nannies and maids, but talking about them in certain ways that positions them as certain kinds of elite or upper class people. And I think that's what I'm kind of getting at right now. And I'm excited about that because it seems to fit with what I have. It has the advantage of not being so much about the nannies, which I don't really have data on, but about how the people talk about it themselves, which I do have the data on. It also seems to fit more with this whole book project, which is about these people themselves and their identities and their class. I have the other literatures if I need them. I'm focusing on these two, basically. One, kind of cultivation of selves in modern life, which sounds giant, but it's not too giant. And two, basically modern upper class people and how they think about themselves. And those things overlap. And three, maybe this kind of consumerism piece, which is about not consuming goods, but actually consuming service labor. In an economy globally that's increasingly service-based, many people are consuming more services all the time, Deliveroo, what have you, and are probably having to do something like this. So it may not just be upper class people. It may not just be people in the Gulf. It may not just be, these expats, but this may be a phenomenon that if you can kind of show different ways it's working, which I think I can, could relate and be useful to thinking about other people in other places, which is something in sociology we often care about. Getting back to the theorizing the Gulf part, right? The question is always, and my wonderful colleague May is always bringing me back to, if you abstract too much, are you kind of losing what this has to do with this place or what this place shapes about what's going on? I think one thing I could see people saying is, well, the kafala system is so unique and these people's kind of employment over these people is so different than anywhere else that, how can you possibly make any generalizations? And I think Russell's new book actually is very helpful. And I was lucky enough to read an advanced copy of it because she asked me to look at it, which is basically saying the kafala system undeniably shapes the power people have. But one way it does it is by leaving so much leeway to the employer that you do get an incredible range of ways nannies and maids are treated, but that doesn't mean they're all treated badly. And that definitely doesn't mean they're all treated the same way. Anyway, so I'm still not sure exactly what my actual argument is, although I think I'm getting there. I'm always reminded of a metaphor my advisor used, which is it's like when you're putting together IKEA furniture and you do this part, like you're doing your data thing over here, and then you go run back and do your theory thing over here, and then run back and do your data thing over here. I think in the end, when you do it this way, it really does fit very well. And I'm not the fastest worker in the world by any means. I don't have 1 million publications, but I do think, and one thing I'm lucky that I get to do and spend time on this is that when it's done, like those things do fit together well. And it feels like the story is enhanced by the theory and vice versa. And that, which is the whole fun of this, I think, for me.